A man in a simple grey hoodie stands before a gate of shimmering glass and chrome. This isn't just any gate. It's the exclusive entrance to the Elysian Lounge at Westwood International Airport, a sanctuary for the world's elite. On the other side, champagne flutes chime and billion-dollar deals are whispered. But for the man in the hoodie, the gate remains firmly shut. The manager, a man in a suit so sharp it could cut diamonds, looks him up and down with disdain. A quiet humiliation unfolds under the cold, fluorescent lights. That manager has no idea that he isn't just closing a door on one man. He's closing the door on the entire future of the airport. By sunrise, the $1.5 billion meant to build that future will have vanished into thin air. The air in Westwood International Airport, WIA, hummed with a unique frequency of controlled chaos. It was the sound of 1,000 journeys beginning and ending, a symphony of rolling suitcases, muffled announcements, and the low thrum of jet engines waiting on the tarmac. For most, this was a place of transition, a necessary limbo. For a select few, it was an extension of their boardroom, their private club. The Elysian Lounge was the heart of that exclusivity. Phineas Ashford navigated the river of travellers with an unhurried grace. He was a man who moved through the world without needing to announce his presence. At 38, he possessed a stillness that was often mistaken for disinterest. He wore no logos, a plain, high-quality grey hoodie, dark jeans, and a pair of minimalist sneakers that cost more than the average monthly rent. On his wrist was a simple, unadorned watch with a black face, its value known only to those who understood horological engineering. He carried a single, worn leather backpack. To a casual observer, he was just another tech worker heading to a conference. He approached the frosted glass doors of the Elysian Lounge. The logo, a stylized E in polished silver, seemed to float in the air. Inside, silhouettes moved in opulent comfort. A man in a tailored suit stood guard, not a security brute, but something far more intimidating, a gatekeeper of status. His name was Merrick Fairborn, and he was the director of VIP client relations. The title was a euphemism for being the man paid to keep the wrong sort of people out. Merrick's eyes, the color of chilled steel, flickered over Phineas, and in a microsecond he conducted a full and damning appraisal. The hoodie, the jeans, the backpack, the quiet, unassuming posture. His lips tightened into a razor-thin line of disapproval. "Can I help you?" Merrick asked. The tone was not one of assistance, but of challenge. Phineas met his gaze, his own expression unreadable. "I have a meeting inside, with Robert Henderson." Robert Henderson was the CEO of the WIA Corporation, the man spearheading the airport's audacious $1.5 billion Project Sky Spire modernization. Mentioning his name should have been a key. For Merrick, it was an insult. The idea that this person had a meeting with the CEO inside his lounge was preposterous. "Mr. Henderson is in a very important meeting," Merrick said, his voice dripping with condescension. He made a subtle gesture to a nearby security guard. "I'm afraid there must be some mistake. This lounge is for our Elysian members and their invited guests." He emphasized the word invited as if it were a foreign concept to Phineas. "I am his guest," Phineas stated simply. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The truth was the truth. Merrick allowed a small, cruel smile to play on his lips. "Sir, please, let's not make a scene. The public food court is on the lower level. I'm sure you'll find something more appropriate there." The dismissal was absolute. It was a public branding. A few people in the vicinity, sensing the friction, slowed their pace. Their curiosity piqued. Phineas felt their stares. He wasn't embarrassed. He was calculating. He had faced far worse than this in boardrooms where his ideas were dismissed before he even spoke, only to be adopted later when presented by a white colleague. He had endured the quiet slights, the surprise on people's faces when they learned he was the founder, the CEO, the lead investor. This was just a cruder, more direct version of the same old story. "There is no mistake," Phineas said, his voice dropping a register, becoming colder. "My name is Phineas Ashford. Please inform Mr. Henderson that I have arrived." Merrick scoffed, a short, sharp bark of a laugh. He pulled out a tablet, his fingers tapping with theatrical annoyance. "Ashford, you said? X." He pretended to search. No one by that name on the guest list. Not for Mr. Henderson, not for anyone." He held up the blank screen as if it were a verdict. "Now, if you don't move along, I'll have security escort you." The security guard, a burly man named Peterson, took a step forward. He looked uncomfortable, caught between his duty and the palpable injustice of the scene. Phineas stood his ground for a moment longer. He looked past Merrick, through the pristine glass, and saw Robert Henderson inside, laughing with two other men in expensive suits. They were celebrating a deal that was not yet closed. They were celebrating a future that was, at this very moment, hanging by a single, fraying thread. He gave Merrick a final, piercing look. It was a look that held no anger, no pleading. It was a look of assessment, a final data point being entered into a complex equation. Then he simply nodded. "Very well," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. He turned and walked away, melting back into the anonymous flow of the concourse. He didn't look back. Merrick Fairbairn watched him go, a smug smirk of triumph on his face. He had protected the sanctity of his lounge. He had put the man in the hoodie in his place. He turned back to his post, feeling a surge of self-satisfaction, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just detonated a financial bomb that would vaporize his world. Phineas found a quiet corner near a departure gate. He pulled out his phone. It was a custom-built device, stark and utilitarian. He didn't tap on an app. He opened a secure terminal and typed a series of commands. It was a short, elegant string of code, a digital key turning a digital lock. Then he made a single brief phone call. "It's me," he said into the phone. "Execute contingency 7. Full recall. No delay." He listened for a moment, then replied. "The partnership is dissolved. The foundational criteria of mutual respect were not met." "Confirm execution." He received his confirmation and ended the call. He put the phone back in his pocket, slung his backpack over his shoulder, and walked towards the main exit. He wasn't flying anywhere today. His work here was done. The sun had barely crested the horizon, casting long, dramatic shadows across the runways of Westward International Airport. Inside the executive suite, on the top floor of the WIA tower, the mood was anything but serene. It was 6:05 a.m., and the world of Robert Henderson, CEO, was actively disintegrating. Henderson, a man whose silver hair and tailored suits usually projected an aura of unshakable authority, was pacing his cavernous office like a caged animal. His face, normally tanned from weekend yachting trips, was a pasty, blotchy white. Across from him, slumped in a leather chair, was David Chen, the chief financial officer, a numbers wizard who currently looked as if he'd seen a ghost. "Say it again," Henderson commanded, his voice hoarse. "Say it again, but make it make sense." David swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He adjusted his glasses and stared at the tablet in his trembling hands as if hoping the words would change. "It's gone, Robert. The entire Project Skyspire escrow account. $1,500,000,000. It's empty." "Empty? What do you mean, empty? Money doesn't just go empty. Was it a transfer? A hack? Where did it go? Henderson's voice was escalating into a near shout. That's the problem, David whispered, his voice trembling. It didn't go anywhere. According to our system, and the bank's, the transaction is logged as a capital recall by the primary funding entity. It wasn't stolen. It was taken back. Henderson stopped pacing. He stared at his CFO. Taken back? By who? The funding consortium is a dozen different entities. We have contracts thicker than a phone book. Who has the authority to recall the entire principal amount unilaterally? I don't know, David admitted, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. The entity is listed under a designation code I've never seen before, OD Cap 77. It's a ghost. I spent the last 2 hours on the phone with our contacts at Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs. They're in the dark. They helped facilitate the fund, but the primary source was routed through a private equity firm, so discreet it's practically a state secret. A firm called Odyssey Capital Partners. Henderson ran a hand through his perfectly coiffed hair, dislodging it for the first time in years. Odyssey Capital. I've never heard of them. Nobody has, David said bleakly. They were the silent whale, the one who made the entire project viable. Our agreements were with their intermediaries. We were so eager to get the funding that we didn't push to unmask the final principle. We just saw the wire transfer confirmation for $1.5 billion and celebrated. The memory of last night's celebration in the Elysian lounge turned sour in Henderson's stomach. The champagne, the smug handshakes, the toasts to a glorious future. He'd been celebrating the completion of a deal that apparently was never as solid as he believed. His intercom buzzed, a shrill, unwelcome sound. "Mr. Henderson," his assistant's voice crackled, full of panic. "The FAA is on line 1, the mayor's office on line 2, and a reporter from the Wall Street Journal is on line 3. They're all asking about a rumor that Project Sky Spire has been defunded." Henderson felt a wave of nausea. The news was already leaking. In the digital age, a secret of this magnitude had a lifespan measured in minutes. "Stall them," he barked, before slumping into his chair, the fight momentarily draining out of him. "David, get the cybersecurity team in here now. I don't care what the bank says. This has to be a hack. The most sophisticated, high-level cyber attack in corporate history. That's our story. We are the victims here. Find me evidence. Find me a digital footprint, a ghost in the machine. Anything." It was a desperate gambit. If it was a hack, they could freeze assets, launch federal investigations, and maybe, just maybe, recover the funds. They would be seen as victims of a crime. But if it was a legal recall, they were just failures. Monumental, public failures. Within 20 minutes, the boardroom adjacent to Henderson's office had become a high-tech war room. Dr. Nina Sharma, WIA's head of cybersecurity, a brilliant woman with a PhD from MIT and a no-nonsense demeanor, stood before a massive smart screen displaying lines of transaction data. Her team, a group of the best white-hat hackers money could buy, typed furiously on their laptops, their faces illuminated by the glow of their screens. Henderson, David, and the rest of the executive board watched, their anxiety a palpable force in the room. "Report!" Henderson clipped. Dr. Sharma turned, pushing her glasses up the bridge of her nose. Her expression was grim. "There's nothing to report, Robert. That's the problem. I've analyzed the transaction from every conceivable angle. There are no signs of intrusion, no malware, no phishing, no brute force attack. The firewall is untouched. The recall command was initiated using a triple encrypted quantum key that was issued to the primary investor. It wasn't a breach. It was an authorized command. It's like the owner of a house walking in the front door with their own key and taking all their furniture. You can't call that a break-in." "So you're saying it's legitimate?" David asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm saying it's technically flawless," Dr. Sharma corrected. "The system behaved exactly as it was designed to. It received a valid instruction from a verified source and executed it. The ghost, as you called it, is the legitimate owner. Whoever Odyssey Capital is, they wanted their money back, and they had the keys to the kingdom to do it." The silence in the room was absolute. The hum of the servers seemed to grow louder, a funeral dirge for their ambitions. The story of a cyber attack was dead. They weren't victims. They had been dismissed, fired by their own benefactor. Henderson stared at the screen, at the clean, perfect, irrefutable lines of code that had erased his legacy. A single, terrifying question echoed in the silent room, a question no one dared to ask aloud. Who had they angered so profoundly that they would detonate a $1.5 billion project with a single keystroke? And why? The investigation, if it could even be called that, deepened the mystery rather than solving it. By midday, Henderson, under immense pressure, had been forced to make the call he was dreading. He brought in the FBI. 2 agents from the Bureau's cybercrime division arrived, looking as grim and serious as the situation demanded. Special Agent Cole and Special Agent Martinez were professionals who had seen everything from international ransomware gangs to teenage hackers causing chaos from their parents' basements. They listened patiently as Henderson and Dr. Sharma laid out the impossible scenario. "So, let me get this straight," Agent Cole said, a tall, methodical man who chose his words carefully. $1.5 billion were withdrawn from a secure escrow account overnight. Your team, he nodded at Dr. Sharma, finds no evidence of a breach, and the bank confirms the transaction was initiated by the account's primary signatory using legitimate, multi-factor authentication protocols. "That's correct," Henderson said, hating how weak it sounded. "And you have no idea who this primary signatory, Odyssey Capital Partners, actually is?" Agent Martinez asked, her sharp gaze missing nothing. "Our relationship was managed through a series of legal intermediaries and investment banks," CFO David Chen mumbled, sweating under her scrutiny. "It's standard practice with ultra-high net worth private equity to ensure anonymity." Agent Martinez raised an eyebrow. "Standard practice not to know who's funding the largest infrastructure project in the state's history? That sounds less like standard practice and more like willful ignorance." The WIA executives had no answer. The truth was, they had been blinded by the sheer size of the investment. The money was green, the contracts were signed, and that was all that had mattered. The FBI agents, along with Dr. Sharma's team, spent the next 8 hours in a digital deep dive that pushed the boundaries of forensic analysis. They dissected every line of code. They ran algorithmic traces on the transaction's path. They subpoenaed bank records from 3 different continents. Every path they took led to the same frustrating, impossible conclusion. The withdrawal wasn't just clean, it was pristine. It was a masterpiece of digital finance. "It's like trying to find a footprint in the sky," Agent Cole grumbled, rubbing his temples in the now stale air of the boardroom. The transaction originated from a cloaked server, bounced through a dozen encrypted nodes in non-extradition countries, and resolved at the source bank in Switzerland. But the command itself, it's perfect. The digital signature is immaculate. The quantum key is real. There is no crime here, Mr. Henderson. There's just a contract. Dr. Sharma, who had been silently staring at the transaction's core metadata for the last hour, suddenly spoke up. "There is one thing," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "One thing that's odd." Everyone in the room turned to her. "It's too perfect," she explained, zooming in on a string of alphanumeric code on the giant screen. When a hacker breaches a system, no matter how good they are, they leave traces. A broken line of code, a corrupted log file, an unusual energy signature on the server, what we call digital tool marks. It's like a burglar jimmying a lock. Even the best one will leave microscopic scratches. This transaction has no tool marks. None. She pointed to the screen. But it's more than that. The code used to initiate the recall, it's not just a standard banking command. It's elegant. It's written with a syntax I've only ever seen in one place before. It's the foundational programming language of Apex Logistical Solutions. Henderson frowned. Apex? The shipping and security software company? We were in talks with them. We were supposed to sign a massive deal with their CEO to integrate their new Aegis security and logistics platform as part of Project Skyspire. Exactly, Dr. Sharma said, her eyes widening as a terrible hypothesis began to form in her mind. The Aegis platform is revolutionary. It integrates supply chain management, personnel tracking, and cybersecurity into a single, seamless AI-driven network. The code is famously complex and secure. The person who wrote this recall command knows the Aegis source code intimately. It's their digital fingerprint. A junior legal aide, a young man named Peterson, who had been tasked with fetching coffee and printing documents, suddenly went pale. He had been a fly on the wall all day, listening to everything. "Mr. Henderson," he stammered, his voice barely a squeak. "The Apex deal. I was collating the final signatory documents yesterday." "What about it, son?" Henderson snapped, his patience worn thin. "The CEO of Apex Logistical Solutions, the man you were scheduled to meet yesterday afternoon to finalize the platform integration." "He was your guest," Peterson said, his voice trembling as he made the connection. "I saw his name on the manifest for the Elysian Lounge. His name is Phineas Ashford." The name hung in the air, heavy and menacing. Henderson's mind reeled. Phineas Ashford, the tech genius, the self-made billionaire behind Apex. He was the final piece of the puzzle, the man who was going to provide the technological brain for their new airport. The meeting yesterday. He was supposed to be there, but he never showed up. Henderson had been annoyed, assuming the man was arrogant or had simply blown it off. He had laughed and drunk champagne with his board members instead. "Why wasn't he at the meeting?" Henderson demanded of the room. No one answered. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken dread. It was broken by the buzz of the security chief's phone. He listened for a moment, his face hardening. "Sir," he said to Henderson, "I've just reviewed the security logs for the Elysian Lounge from yesterday afternoon. There was an incident." He proceeded to describe the encounter. A man in a grey hoodie, identifying himself as Phineas Ashford, had tried to enter the lounge for his meeting with the CEO. He was denied entry. He was publicly belittled and turned away by the Director of VIP Client Relations, Merrick Fairborn. The time of the incident was logged at 4:15 p.m. The timestamp on the flawless, elegant, multi-billion-dollar capital recall was 4:19 p.m. A cold, sickening dread washed over Robert Henderson. The ghost had a face. The crime had a motive. It wasn't a hack. It wasn't a hostile corporate maneuver. It was personal. He sank into his chair, the full, catastrophic weight of the situation crushing him. The man they had turned away, the man they had judged unworthy of entering their exclusive club, wasn't just a guest. He wasn't just a contractor. He was the king who had paid for the entire castle, and Merrick Fairborn hadn't just closed a door on him. He had slammed it in the face of their silent benefactor, the architect of their entire future. The revelation shattered the fragile composure of the boardroom. The name Phineas Ashford, once a footnote in their grand project, now echoed like a death knell. The pieces of the puzzle weren't just falling into place, they were slamming together with the force of a tectonic collision. "Get me everything we have on Odyssey Capital Partners," Henderson roared, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and terror. "Legal, finance, I want every document, every email, every footnote scoured. Now!" A frantic scramble ensued. Lawyers and financial analysts, who hours before had been confident and complacent, now tore through digital archives with the desperation of drowning men. The air was thick with the scent of fear and the furious clicking of keyboards. It was the same young legal aid, Peterson, who found the needle in the haystack. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely control the mouse. Sir, I found it. It was buried in Appendix D of the secondary financing agreement, a holding company clause. All eyes turned to the massive screen as Peterson projected the document. It was a dense page of legalese, designed to be overlooked. But there it was, in 9-point font. Odyssey Capital Partners reserves the right to act as the sole managing entity for all assets held by its subsidiary, Apex Logistical Solutions, including but not limited to intellectual property and capital investments. David Chen, the CFO, read it aloud, his voice hollow. "Apex Logistical Solutions is a subsidiary of Odyssey Capital. Oh my God." The connection was irrefutable. Phineas Ashford, the CEO of Apex, wasn't just a partner they were bringing in for his technology. His company was a direct asset of their mysterious, silent investor. He was Odyssey Capital, or at the very least, he held its keys. The $1.5 billion wasn't just an investment in the airport. It was likely the capital Ashford was using to fund the global expansion and integration of his own Aegis platform, with WIA's Project Skyspire as his flagship showroom. They hadn't just insulted a contractor, they had insulted their patron. "Get Merrick Fairbairn in here," Henderson said, his voice dangerously quiet. The rage had subsided, replaced by an Arctic cold. "Get him now." Merrick Fairbairn strolled into the boardroom 5 minutes later, a picture of smug ignorance. He had been called away from his duties at the lounge and clearly felt it was an imposition. He saw the grim faces of the CEO, the CFO, the board members, and the 2 FBI agents, and assumed there was a serious security threat he needed to be briefed on. "Robert," he said, with an easy familiarity that made Henderson's skin crawl. "What's the emergency? Another security scare?" "Merrick," Henderson began, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Yesterday afternoon, at approximately 4:15 p.m., you denied a man entry to the Elysian Lounge, a guest of mine." Merrick's mind cycled through the events of the previous day. The confrontation was a minor blip, a satisfying moment of reinforcing standards. "Ah, yes. The fellow in the hoodie. He was causing a disturbance, claiming to have a meeting with you. He wasn't on the list. I handled it discreetly." He smiled, expecting praise for his diligence. "You handled it," Henderson repeated, the words tasting like poison. "Tell me, Merrick, what exactly did you say to him?" "I simply informed him that the lounge has a dress code and a standard of conduct, and that he was not welcome." "I suggested the food court might be more his speed," Merrick said proudly. "We can't let the standards of the Elysian slip, Robert. It's all about perception." A bitter, hysterical laugh escaped Henderson's lips. "Perception? Yes, it is all about perception, isn't it?" He stood up and walked around the table until he was standing directly in front of his director of VIP client relations. "The fellow in the hoodie," Henderson hissed, his face inches from Merrick's, was Phineas Ashford. The name clearly meant nothing to Merrick. He just looked confused. "And?" "Phineas Ashford is the founder and CEO of Apex Logistical Solutions, the company whose technology was the entire backbone of Project Sky Spire," Henderson explained, his voice rising with every word. Merrick still looked blank. "All right. A tech guy. Should have dressed the part," Henderson finally snapped. He grabbed a heavy water pitcher from the table and slammed it down, sending water and ice skittering across the polished wood. "Phineas Ashford is Odyssey Capital, you imbecile!" he screamed, his face turning a deep, apoplectic red. The truth finally pierced Merrick's thick skull. His eyes widened in horror. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost in a Zegna suit. His jaw worked, but no sound came out. "The $1.5 billion that vanished this morning?" Henderson continued, his voice now a venomous whisper. "That was his money. Our entire future, the future of this airport, the jobs of every single person in this room, was in that man's backpack. And you sent him to the food court." Merrick Fairborn stumbled backward, his carefully constructed world imploding in a single, horrifying instant. He leaned against the wall for support, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was looking at the faces of the board members, but he didn't see anger. He saw something far worse, utter, unforgiving ruin. He was the man who had personally, single-handedly, and arrogantly scuttled a billion-dollar ship. I didn't know," he stammered. "That's the point," said Agent Martinez, speaking for the first time since he'd entered the room. Her voice was sharp as broken glass. "You didn't know, and you didn't care to know. You judged, and your judgment just cost this city its biggest development project in a generation." The weight of his catastrophic miscalculation finally crushed Merrick. His arrogance, his prejudice, his pathetic need to enforce a petty hierarchy. It had all led to this. He had mistaken a king for a peasant, and, in his hubris, had thrown him out of the castle gates. Now, he could only watch as the castle itself crumbled into dust around him. The decision was swift and brutal. Before Merrick was even escorted from the room by security, the board was already in damage control. But they all knew it was too late. The damage wasn't a crack in the foundation. The foundation itself had been ripped out from under them. There was only one path forward, however narrow and humiliating it might be. "Get me a number for Phineas Ashford," Henderson said, slumping back into his chair, a defeated man. "I don't care how you get it. Find it. I have to make a call." He had to beg. He had to grovel. He had to appeal to a man whose face he couldn't even recall, a man his organization had deemed unworthy of a simple courtesy. He was about to dial a number that he knew, with chilling certainty, would connect him to the man who now held the fate of his entire world in the palm of his hand. While Westward International Airport descended into a maelstrom of panic and recrimination, Phineas Ashford was in his element, 30,000 feet in the air, encased in the serene, soundproof cabin of his Gulfstream G700. The jet was a marvel of engineering and understated luxury, not gaudy but functional, every detail optimized for productivity and comfort. He sat at a polished carbon fiber table, a holographic schematic of a new port logistics system shimmering in the air above it. The world below was a patchwork of green and brown, distant and irrelevant. His satellite phone chimed, a soft, unobtrusive tone. The caller ID displayed a number he didn't recognize, but the encrypted source tag told him everything he needed to know. It was being routed from the executive wing of the WIA tower. He let it ring 3 times before gesturing at the air, and the call connected, the voice of Robert Henderson filling the cabin on speaker. "Mr. Ashford? Phineas, can you hear me?" This is Robert Henderson, CEO of Westward International Airport." The voice was strained, stripped of its usual commanding timbre. It was the voice of a man speaking from the edge of a cliff. Phineas swiped a finger through the hologram, minimizing it. He leaned back in his leather seat and looked out the window at the endless blue sky. "I can hear you, Robert." The use of his first name, so casual and familiar, clearly caught Henderson off guard. There was a pause, a moment of fumbling on the other end. "Mr. Ashford." "Phineas." "Sir." "There has been a terrible misunderstanding." "Has there?" Phineas's voice was calm, almost conversational. It was this unnerving calm that was his most formidable weapon in any negotiation. It signaled that he was operating on a plane of logic and consequence, far beyond the emotional chaos of his opponent. "My understanding of the situation is quite clear. I arrived for a scheduled meeting to finalize a significant partnership. Your representative determined I was unfit to enter the designated meeting place. The partnership was therefore predicated on a flawed premise of mutual respect, so I terminated it. Which part of that is a misunderstanding?" Henderson was flailing, the desperation palpable even through the satellite connection. "The man who spoke to you, Merrick Fairborn, he was acting without my authority, without my knowledge. He has been dealt with, I assure you. Fired. His career is over. What he did was inexcusable, a disgusting aberration that does not represent the values of our organization." "He is your organization, Robert," Phineas countered, his voice still even. "He is the director of VIP client relations, the man you hired to be the face of your most exclusive service. He isn't an aberration. He's a feature. He is a direct reflection of the culture you've cultivated, a culture that judges a man's worth by the brand of his suit, not the content of his character or the value of his ideas." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "I have built my entire enterprise, from a single line of code in a garage to a global logistical network, on one principle: efficiency. And prejudice is the enemy of efficiency. It creates blind spots. It leads to catastrophic miscalculations. You didn't see a potential partner yesterday, Robert. Your gatekeeper saw a threat to his carefully curated world. And that institutional blindness is a risk I am no longer willing to underwrite." "Please, Mr. Ashford," Henderson begged, the last vestiges of his pride crumbling. "The money, the project. This isn't just about an airport. It's about 20,000 jobs. It's about the economic future of this entire region. You can't just walk away. We'll do anything. A public apology. We'll fire the entire executive board if you want. Name your terms. Anything." This was the moment Phineas had been waiting for. Not for the begging, but for the raw, unfiltered admission of what truly mattered to men like Henderson. When their power was threatened, their principles became negotiable. "My terms were met yesterday," Phineas said, his voice turning cold as the stratosphere outside his window. "You see, the $1.5 billion wasn't an investment in your airport, Robert. It was an investment in a vision of a seamless, technologically advanced, and meritocratic future. Your organization demonstrated yesterday that it is fundamentally incompatible with that vision. Reinstating the funding now would be like trying to run my Aegis software on a computer from 1985. The hardware is simply too outdated. The culture is rotten." He leaned forward, his voice becoming a quiet, surgical instrument. "Let me be perfectly clear. This is not a negotiation. There are no terms. This is the consequence of an action. The money is not coming back. The partnership is over. My legal team will be in touch regarding the dissolution of our preliminary agreements. I advise you to have yours ready." "But what are we supposed to do?" Henderson whispered, the question a hollow admission of absolute defeat. Phineas looked out the window again, at the curve of the earth. He was already thinking 10 steps ahead, about a new city, a new partnership, a place where the future was welcomed, not kept out by a velvet rope. "That," Phineas Ashford said, as he gestured to end the call, "is no longer my concern." The line went dead, leaving Robert Henderson in the crushing silence of his office, the dial tone a mocking scream in his ear. He was sitting at the top of a burning tower, and the man who held the only fire extinguisher had just hung up the phone. The fallout from Phineas Ashford's decision was not a quiet implosion. It was a public execution. The story was too juicy, too symbolic to remain contained within the corporate walls of WIA. It erupted into the news cycle with volcanic force. A mid-level employee in the WIA legal department, disgusted by the whole affair and the board's attempt to frame it as a mutually agreed dissolution of partnership, leaked the entire story, including the security log of the Elysian Lounge incident, to a prominent online news outlet. The headline went viral within an hour. Billion-dollar airport project cancelled after tech mogul. Phineas Ashford denied entry to VIP lounge. Source: he didn't look the part. The story was a perfect storm of class, race, and corporate hubris. It was David versus a Goliath who had tripped over his own arrogance. Phineas Ashford, who rarely sought the public eye, became an overnight folk hero in a story he never asked to be a part of. Tech blogs, financial news networks, and social media platforms exploded. Memes depicting a grey hoodie as the most expensive item of clothing in the world proliferated. Food court billionaire started trending. For the antagonists of the story, the karma was swift, brutal, and utterly relentless. Merrick Fairbairn became the face of the scandal. His picture, a smug, corporate headshot, was plastered everywhere. He was instantly transformed from a minor corporate functionary into a global pariah. He was fired. But that was only the beginning. The country club he belonged to, whose board was filled with image-conscious executives, quietly revoked his membership. The charity boards he sat on asked for his immediate resignation. His LinkedIn profile was inundated with thousands of messages of scorn. He tried to issue a public apology, a pathetic, lawyer-vetted statement about a moment of poor judgment. But it was torn to shreds online as a self-serving attempt to save his own skin. He had built his identity on being an arbiter of who belonged, and now he found himself belonging nowhere. He became a prisoner in his own home, a man whose name was synonymous with bigotry and incompetence. Robert Henderson, the CEO, fared no better. His desperate attempt to control the narrative failed spectacularly. At an emergency press conference, he was pummeled with questions he couldn't answer. "Mr. Henderson, can you confirm your director of VIP relations judged $1 billion investor by his hoodie?" "Mr. Henderson, is it true that your first response was to claim you were the victim of a cyber attack?" He crumbled under the pressure, offering weak platitudes about learning experiences and re-evaluating corporate culture. The market wasn't buying it. WIA's stock, which was publicly traded, plummeted by 40% in a single day of trading, wiping out billions in shareholder value. The board, facing shareholder lawsuits and a full-blown PR apocalypse, had no choice. 2 days after his pleading phone call with Phineas, Robert Henderson was forced into a voluntary resignation, a humiliating end to a 30-year career. He left the WIA tower with a single box of his belongings, a man stripped of his power, his reputation, and his future. Westwood International Airport itself became a case study in corporate self-destruction. The half-started construction on Project Sky Spire ground to a halt. Tower cranes, stood idle against the sky like skeletal monuments to failure. Contractors laid off thousands of workers. The city, which had been counting on the project for economic stimulus, was thrown into financial turmoil, leading to a bitter public feud between the mayor's office and the now gutted WIA board. The Elysian Lounge, once a symbol of prestige, became an emblem of shame. Membership numbers dropped as executives and celebrities, not wanting to be associated with the scandal, quietly moved to other airline lounges. The shimmering glass doors that Merrick Fairborn had so proudly guarded now felt like the entrance to a tomb. The consequences cascaded outwards, a ripple effect of ruin. The investment banks that had intermediated the deal faced intense scrutiny for their lack of due diligence. Members of the WIA board who had celebrated with Henderson that fateful afternoon found their own positions on other corporate boards challenged. The hard karma was not just that they lost the money. It was that the very system of exclusion and superficial judgment they had built their careers on was the weapon that brought about their own downfall. They had worshipped at the altar of perception, and in the end, the perception of them as arrogant, prejudiced fools was the only legacy they had left. In his quiet, decisive action, Phineas Ashford hadn't just withdrawn his money. He had held up a mirror, and the reflection had shattered them all. 3 months is a lifetime in the digital age, a brief pause in the seasons, and an eternity for a project bleeding money. At Westwood International Airport, time had frozen into a state of perpetual decay. The colossal skeleton of Project Skyspire stood as a monument to hubris, its steel beams beginning to show the first faint freckles of rust under the coastal sky. The wind, once filled with the sounds of construction and progress, now only whistled through the empty latticework, a mournful, hollow tune. A lone security vehicle would occasionally trace the perimeter, its presence a reminder less of protection and more of a protracted funeral watch. The story of WIA had become a business school case study on the catastrophic cost of cultural rot. The Elysian Lounge, now infamous, was ironically busier than ever. But its clientele had changed. It was filled with disaster tourists and morbidly curious business travelers, all hoping to catch a glimpse of the place where a billion-dollar dream had been killed by a sneer. The brand of exclusivity it had once cultivated had curdled into a reputation for bigotry, an invisible stain no amount of champagne could wash away. Far from this urban graveyard of ambition, Phineas Ashford was not looking back. He had seen the news reports, the desperate apologies from the new WIA board, the stock charts that resembled a cardiac arrest. He felt no triumph, no flicker of vengeful satisfaction. To him, the collapse of WIA was not a victory. It was a predictable system failure. A machine built with flawed parts had finally, inevitably, broken down. His focus, as always, was on building a better machine. That new machine was taking shape 200 miles down the coast in the overlooked city of North Bay. Its municipal airport was a tired, sprawling complex from another era, but its mayor, Sophia Cho, was not. A first-generation American with a degree in urban planning and a reputation for relentless, data-driven optimism, she had spent her first term in office fighting for a future her city council could barely imagine. She was in a budget meeting, arguing over funding for a new public library, when her assistant interrupted, her eyes wide. "Mayor, there's a call for you. A man named David Chen. He says he represents Odyssey Capital Partners." Sophia had never heard of them. "Tell them to schedule a meeting with Economic Development, please." "Mayor," her assistant insisted, lowering her voice. He said they're prepared to offer a $1.5 billion private investment into the city's infrastructure, starting with the airport. The budget meeting came to a dead stop. The argument over the library's $50,000 shortfall suddenly seemed absurd. $1.5 billion was not just a number. It was a miracle. A figure so large it felt like a prank. Sophia took the call in her office, her pragmatic mind already cataloguing the 100 ways this could be a scam. But David Chen, the former CFO of WIA, who had been quietly headhunted by Phineas Ashford for his competence and integrity, was professional and direct. He explained the investment vehicle, the firm's interest in North Bay's untapped potential, and its desire to create a landmark public-private partnership. He mentioned the firm's principal was a man named Phineas Ashford. The name rang a bell, but Sophia placed it in the context of the recent WIA scandal. It wasn't until Chen clarified that Ashford's firm was the funding from the WIA project that the entire incredible picture snapped into focus for her. They weren't just getting an investment, they were getting the prize WIA had so spectacularly fumbled. Now, 3 months later, the initial disbelief had transformed into a whirlwind of creative energy. In a sunlit conference room in North Bay's modest city hall, Phineas Ashford and Mayor Cho stood over a shimmering holographic blueprint. It was a vision of an airport that looked nothing like the gilded cage of WIA. "We're not just building a terminal, Mayor," Phineas said, his voice resonating with the quiet passion of a creator. He traced a line of light with his finger. "We're building an integrated aerotropolis. The central hub will be powered entirely by renewable energy, managed by an AI that optimizes gate traffic, baggage handling, and energy consumption in real time. That's the Aegis platform at its core. The energy savings alone would revolutionize our city's carbon footprint," Sophia murmured, her planner's mind racing through the implications. But the WIA board would have said a design, "This open has too much non-revenue generating space." "They measured the wrong metrics," Phineas replied without missing a beat. "They measured exclusivity. We're measuring connectivity, opportunity, and participation. That's a metric that pays dividends for generations, not just the next quarter." He gestured to an adjacent cluster of buildings in the hologram. "Surrounding the hub, we're funding a tech campus, a logistics training center partnered with North Bay Community College, an R&D facility for sustainable aviation fuels, and an incubator for local startups. The entry requirement for the incubator won't be a business degree or a network of connections. It will be a viable idea. We'll provide the seed capital and the mentorship." Sophia looked at him, truly seeing the man behind the myth for the first time. The media had painted him as a vengeful titan of industry, but the man before her spoke not of markets and profits, but of ecosystems and potential. "Why North Bay, Mr. Ashford?" she asked, the question direct. "With your capital, you could have gone anywhere in the world." Phineas turned from the hologram and looked out the window at her city, a tapestry of working-class neighborhoods, small businesses, and undeveloped coastline. "Because you were hungry for it," he said simply. "Because your proposals weren't about building monuments to yourselves. They were about building a better quality of life for your citizens. And because you see the future as something you build, not something you purchase." He paused. The incident at Westwood. It was just a data point. It confirmed a hypothesis I've had for a long time. The old models of power, built on exclusion and pedigree, are obsolete. They're security risks. They are inefficient. The future will be built by communities that are open, agile, and collaborative. He then zoomed in on the terminal's interior design. There were no hidden fortresses for the wealthy. Instead, the plan featured modular, soundproof work pods that any traveler could reserve for an hour. There were expansive, curated art installations featuring local artists, interactive learning exhibits for children, and quiet, serene gardens. The premium experience was democratized, available to anyone who needed it, not just those who held a certain credit card. True infrastructure isn't just about concrete and steel, Phineas said, his voice low and certain. It's about creating opportunity. Access. He looked directly at Mayor Cho, a shared understanding passing between them. We're building a new front door to the world, and I want everyone to have a key. The karmic justice of it all was breathtakingly elegant. The ruin of Fairborn and Henderson was not the end game. It was merely the clearing of deadwood so something new could grow. The real consequence of their prejudice wasn't the money they lost, but the vibrant future they inadvertently handed to their competition. As the meeting concluded, Phineas stood for a moment at the window, looking not at the airport, but at the sprawling city beyond. He wasn't motivated by the memory of a closed door. He was driven by the vision of millions of doors opening. Revenge is a transaction concerned with the past, a futile attempt to balance a ledger that is already closed. Phineas Ashford was not in the business of settling old accounts. He was in the business of building new worlds, and in the hopeful, striving city of North Bay, he had finally found the partners and the proving ground to build his masterpiece. So what's the real takeaway from the story of Phineas Ashford and the gate that cost $1 billion? It's a powerful, real-world reminder that prejudice isn't just morally wrong, it's disastrously inefficient. The arrogance of one man, propped up by a corporate culture that valued appearances over substance, didn't just cause a momentary embarrassment, it triggered a catastrophic failure. True power, the story shows us, isn't loud and boastful. It's quiet, it's decisive, and it often wears a simple grey hoodie. Phineas Ashford's ultimate move wasn't one of revenge, it was one of creation. He didn't just tear down a broken system, he went and built a better one from the ground up. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button to let us know. Share it with someone who needs to hear this message. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into stories of karma, consequence, and the hidden forces that shape our world. We've got so much more to share with you. And leave a comment below. What do you think was the most satisfying moment of karma in this story? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks for listening.